It is shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning on March 28, 1942. The Loire estuary off the coast of occupied France is dark, cold, and hostile. A small flotilla of vessels moves in tight formation across water that glitters faintly beneath a sliver of moon. At the head of the column is something that does not belong here, an old American destroyer, repainted in the style of the German Kriegsmarine, flying a Nazi ensign, and packed from bow to stern with more than 4 tons of high explosives set on delayed fuses. Beside her, in 2 columns, are 18 small wooden motor launches, each barely the length of a cricket pitch, carrying commandos dressed for battle. The men on those launches can feel the vibration of the engines through the soles of their boots. They have been told the odds. They have come anyway. The destination is the port of Saint-Nazaire on the Atlantic coast of France, specifically the largest dry dock in the world. The Normandy dock, as it is known, was built in the 1930s to service the great ocean liners of the age. It is 350 meters long and more than 50 meters wide, capable of holding any vessel afloat. But in the spring of 1942, it holds a far more dangerous significance than the accommodation of luxury ships. It is, at that moment, the only dry dock on the entire Atlantic coast large enough to receive the German battleship Tirpitz, sister ship to the Bismarck, which had terrorized the North Atlantic less than a year before. If the Tirpitz were ever to break out into open ocean and require repairs, Saint-Nazaire was the only place she could go. Remove that dock and the Tirpitz becomes a strategic prisoner, too valuable to risk without a safe harbor within reach. The plan to destroy it is breathtaking in its audacity and sobering in its expected cost. The destroyer at the head of the column, HMS Campbelltown, will ram the dock gates at speed, embedding herself like a cork in a bottle. Her hidden explosives will detonate hours later, obliterating the gates beyond any hope of repair. The commandos will fan out across the port, destroying pumping stations, winding houses, and submarine pens with precision charges. And then, if any of them survive the withdrawal, the motor launches will carry the survivors back to open sea, where a submarine will be waiting. Combined Operations Headquarters had studied the plan for weeks. Some of the most experienced military minds in Britain had examined it and arrived at the same conclusion. It was, in all likelihood, a death sentence for the men who carried it out. Even Winston Churchill, who had never shied away from audacious gambles, looked at the casualty projections and paused. The raid, he feared, would cost more than it could ever gain. He was wrong about the cost, but he was catastrophically right about the price. To understand why the Saint-Nazaire raid was even conceived, you must first understand the state of Britain's war in the opening months of 1942. It was, put simply, going badly. The fall of Singapore in February had been a humiliation of almost incomprehensible scale, the largest surrender of British-led forces in history. In North Africa, Rommel was advancing. The Atlantic convoys were being savaged by German U-boats at a rate that threatened to strangle the island nation, and over everything hung the shadow of the Tirpitz. The Bismarck had demonstrated what a single German capital ship could do. In May 1941, she had sunk HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, in less than 3 minutes, killing all but 3 of her 1,418-man crew. Hunting her down had consumed enormous resources and attention. The Bismarck was eventually sunk, but the exercise had cost the Navy dearly. The Tirpitz was her sister ship, and she sat in the Norwegian fjords like a loaded pistol held to Britain's temple. She had not yet broken out into open ocean, but the threat that she might was enough to pin down an entire fleet. The Admiralty calculated that if the Tirpitz ever sortied into the Atlantic, she could decimate convoy routes with near impunity. She was faster than most of what could catch her, and better armored than most of what could fight her. The critical vulnerability, strategically speaking, was repair facilities. A ship of her size, 52,600 tons at full load, could not simply pull into any harbor. She needed a dry dock of extraordinary proportions. In all of the Atlantic coast there was precisely one, the Normandy dock at Saint-Nazaire. Destroy it, and the Tirpitz becomes a risk her commanders might never be willing to take. She would be trapped in the Baltic or the Norwegian fjords, impotent as a strategic threat. The problem was that Saint-Nazaire was not an easy target. It was defended by shore batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and a garrison of German soldiers. The approaches through the Loire estuary were heavily mined and patrolled. The dock itself was a colossal, reinforced concrete structure. It could not be destroyed by bombing alone, as the RAF had discovered in previous attempts. The Americans had not yet developed the precision bombing capability that might one day threaten it. The dock gates, the critical component, were each over 50 feet tall and constructed of steel and timber so dense that no conventional explosive dropped from altitude could be guaranteed to destroy them. The only answer, the planners at Combined Operations concluded, was to drive an explosive charge directly into the dock gates, at speed, with a ship. The organization responsible for planning Operation Chariot was Combined Operations Headquarters, under the command of Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. Mountbatten had taken over Combined Operations in October 1941 with a specific brief to conduct offensive operations against the occupied European coastline, to keep pressure on German forces, to test invasion techniques, and to demonstrate to a war-weary public and to Allied partners that Britain was still fighting. Saint-Nazaire was, by any measure, the most ambitious operation his headquarters had yet attempted. The plan was developed primarily by Captain John Hughes Hallett of the Royal Navy, and refined in close collaboration with the Army's No. 2 Commando, under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, and the Naval Force Commander, Commander Robert Ryder. What they devised was a three-part operation of remarkable complexity. The first element was the ship itself. HMS Campbelltown was a former American destroyer, transferred to the Royal Navy under the 1940 Lend-Lease Agreement. She was old, launched in 1919, already past her prime by the standards of 1942. But she had two qualities that made her invaluable. She was expendable, and her shallow draft meant she could navigate the Loire estuary without grounding on the sandbanks that would have stopped a heavier vessel. She was stripped of everything superfluous, lightened by the removal of torpedo tubes, fuel, ammunition, and fittings, until her draft was reduced enough to traverse the estuary at the required depth. Her funnels were cut at an angle and reduced in number to mimic the silhouette of a German torpedo boat, a deception that would, the planners hoped, buy precious minutes as she approached the port. Then came the explosive charge. Fitted into her forward compartments, directly behind the bow, was a device constructed from 24 depth charges, each containing approximately 180 kilograms of amytol explosive, encased in steel and set in concrete to focus the blast. The total weight of explosive was roughly 4¼ tons. The charges were connected to delayed fuses, pencil fuses of the type used by the Special Operations Executive, designed to detonate 8 hours after activation. The detonation, when it finally came, would need to be powerful enough not merely to damage the dock gates, but to destroy them so thoroughly that repair would be measured in years rather than months. The timing mechanism was carefully considered. 8 hours of delay meant the Campbelltown would ram the gates at approximately 0130 and detonate around 0930, well after any German investigation of the vessel would have begun. The engineers calculated that the concrete casing around the charges would direct the force of the explosion downward and outward rather than upward, maximizing the damage to the gate structure and the sill upon which it rested. It was, in essence, the world's largest shaped charge, concealed inside the hull of a warship, disguised as an enemy vessel, sailing into the most heavily defended port in occupied France. The commandos would land from the motor launches alongside and secure the surrounding area, whilst demolition parties, specially trained over weeks at the port of Cardiff and the Bristol docks, placed additional charges on the pumping stations, the inner caisson, the winding gear, and the U-boat pens. Every man knew his precise target. Every demolition team had practiced until the charges could be laid in darkness under fire in under 3 minutes. The withdrawal was to be by motor launch back down the Loire to the waiting submarine HMS Sturgeon, 12 miles out to sea. The approach to Saint-Nazaire had gone, against all probability, almost according to plan. The flotilla had navigated minefields, dodged a German patrol vessel, and closed to within 2 miles of the port before the shore batteries finally illuminated them with searchlights and opened fire. Commander Ryder, displaying a coolness that would later earn him the Victoria Cross, ordered the signal lamps to send a German recognition signal, a prearranged code obtained through intelligence channels, and for several crucial minutes the German gunners hesitated. Those minutes were the difference between Campbelltown reaching the dock gates or being sunk in the approach channel. At 1:34 on March 28, 1942, just 4 minutes behind schedule, HMS Campbelltown struck the outer gate of the Normandy dock at approximately 19 knots. The impact drove her bow 18 feet into and through the gate, embedding her so completely that the dock gate and the ship became, in effect, a single structure. The commandos, who had been lying flat on her decks to avoid the fire during the approach, leapt to their feet and began to move. Lieutenant Colonel Newman was ashore within seconds. The demolition teams followed, splitting left and right towards their designated targets. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It keeps this kind of history reaching people who care about it. What followed on the docks of Saint-Nazaire was a battle of extraordinary ferocity and courage. The commandos fought through the port against an alerted and increasingly reinforced German garrison. Demolition parties reached their targets under fire and placed their charges. The pumping house on the south side of the dock was destroyed. The winding gear for the inner caisson was demolished. The impeller motors that drove the dock's hydraulic system were wrecked. In the harbor itself, 2 of the motor torpedo boats fired delayed action torpedoes into the outer lock gates, torpedoes that would detonate the following afternoon, causing a second wave of destruction that the Germans had not anticipated. But the withdrawal was catastrophic. The motor launches, constructed of wood and petrol tanks, were devastatingly vulnerable to the fire from both shores of the narrow estuary. Several were hit and erupted in flames within sight of the shore. Of the 18 motor launches that had entered the Loire, only 4 made it back to sea. Soldiers and sailors alike swam for their lives in dark, burning water. Of the approximately 621 men who had sailed on Operation Chariot, 169 were killed and 215 taken prisoner. Only 228 returned to Britain. The German forces at Saint-Nazaire initially believed they had repelled the raid. Campbelltown sat embedded in the dock gate, apparently inert. German officers and soldiers boarded her to inspect the damage. Some reports suggest as many as 40 or 50 personnel were on or around the ship by mid-morning. At approximately 10:35 on March 28, 1942, roughly 9 hours after the ramming, the delayed charges detonated. The blast was, by every account, enormous. Campbelltown and the dock gate essentially ceased to exist. The Germans inspecting her were killed almost to a man. The dock sill was torn apart. The inner caisson, already damaged by commando charges, was rendered useless. The massive hydraulic machinery that raised and lowered the gates was shattered. The exact number of German casualties from the explosion remains uncertain. German records from this period are incomplete, and some were deliberately destroyed. Contemporary British estimates place the figure at several hundred. What is not in dispute is the physical result. The Normandy dock was put completely out of action. German engineers, surveying the wreckage, concluded that full repairs would take years. They were correct. The dock did not return to service until 1947, 2 years after the end of the war. The Tirpitz never used it. She remained in the Norwegian fjords for the rest of her operational life, where she was eventually destroyed by RAF Lancaster bombers, dropping tallboy earthquake bombs in November 1944. The Germans had, prior to March 1942, considered the direct assault on a major port using explosive-laden vessels to be so operationally implausible that no serious defensive measures had been taken against it. The idea of disguising a warship as an enemy vessel and sailing it directly into a defended harbor was viewed as the province of fantasy rather than strategy. The British had not merely done the implausible. They had executed it with sufficient precision that the primary objective was achieved despite the failure of the withdrawal. The Americans, following the raid, studied the Campbelltown concept with considerable interest. The idea of using expendable vessels as delivery mechanisms for shaped explosive charges influenced subsequent Allied planning for harbor denial operations. The Germans themselves, shaken by the raid, significantly reinforced the coastal defenses along the Atlantic Wall, forces that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. No other Allied nation attempted a raid of comparable ambition against equivalent infrastructure during the Second World War. The Americans launched commando raids,